Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, read by Tony Robinson. Chapter 1, Born in the Workhouse. On a cold and wet night, a young woman was found lying in the street. You could tell she'd walked a long way, for her shoes were as thin and worn out as she was, and though she was about to have a baby, she had no wedding ring. No one knew anything else about her, neither where she'd come from, nor where she was going. This poor young girl was taken into the workhouse, and there she had her baby. "Let me hold him," she whispered. When the surgeon put the boy in her arms, she pressed her cold white lips passionately on his forehead, then fell back and died. Oliver Twist was an orphan. As there was no one who could look after a baby in the workhouse, Oliver was sent to a nursery to be looked after by an elderly woman called Mrs. Mann. In truth, Mrs. Mann was fonder of looking after herself than the children in her care. There was never enough food, and always too many beatings. But at least Oliver had friends, and he knew nothing else. And so it was that on Oliver's 9th birthday, he found himself with two of these friends locked in the coal cellar for daring to be hungry, when Mr. Bumble, the beadle in charge of the workhouse, unexpectedly paid a visit. "Goodness gracious, Mr. Bumble, how glad I am to see you, surely," said Mrs. Mann. She gestured to the maid to unlock the boys and quickly wash them, and showed Mr. Bumble into the parlour.
"Oliver Twist is 9 years old today," began Mr. Bumble.
"Bless him," said Mrs. Mann.
"And, despite a most generous reward of £10, we've never been able to discover anything about his family."
Mrs. Mann raised her hands in astonishment before adding, "How comes he to have any name at all, then?" The beadle drew himself up with great pride and said, "I invented it. We name our orphans in alphabetical order. The last was an S. Swubble, I named him. This was a T. Twist, I called him. And this Twist is now too old to stay here. I've come out myself to take him back to the workhouse. So let me see him at once." "I'll fetch him immediately," said Mrs. Mann. And Oliver, having by this time been well scrubbed, was presented.
"Will you go along with me, Oliver?"
said Mr. Bumble in a majestic voice, as if Oliver had any choice, which he didn't. So Oliver found himself waving goodbye to his companions of 9 years, and trotting along to keep up with the long strides of Mr. Bumble on his way to the workhouse. As soon as they arrived, Oliver was taken into a room where 8 or 10 fat gentlemen sat around a table.
"Bow to the board,"
said Bumble. Seeing no board but the table, Oliver luckily bowed to that. But the sight of so many gentlemen made him tremble, and he was unable to answer their questions without crying.
"Well, boy,"
said one red-faced gentleman,
"you have come here to be taught a useful trade. So you'll begin to pick oakum tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock.
Oliver bowed again, and was then hurried away to a large ward, where on a rough, hard bed he cried himself to sleep. The room in which the boys were fed was a large stone hall with a copper at one end, out of which the master ladled the gruel at meal times. Each boy had one bowl of gruel and no more, except on festive days, when they were also allowed a small portion of bread. Oliver Twist and his companions suffered the torture of slow starvation for 3 months. At last it became too much for one boy who was tall for his age. "If I don't get more to eat soon," I'll be forced to eat the boy who sleeps next to me. I will, you know." The other boys believed him, and it was clear that someone would have to ask for more food. The boys drew lots to decide who should do this, and Oliver picked the short straw. That evening, the boys took their usual places. The master doled out their gruel, and when the boys had finished eating, which was not very much later, they began to whisper to each other, nudging and winking at Oliver. Nervous, but desperately hungry, Oliver stood up and walked towards the master. "Please, sir, I want some more." The master turned pale. He looked at the small boy in astonishment. "What?" he said at last in a faint voice. "Please, sir," replied Oliver, "I want some more." The master hit Oliver with the ladle and shouted for the beadle. The board were sitting in their room when Mr. Bumble rushed in. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen," he said, "Oliver Twist has asked for more." There was a general start, and a look of horror crossed their faces. "For more?" said Mr. Limbkins. "Do I understand that he asked for more after he had eaten his supper?" "He did, sir," replied Bumble. "That boy will hang," said the gentleman. Nobody disputed this, and they all began talking at once. Oliver was ordered into instant confinement, and the next morning a poster was pasted on the outside of the gate offering a reward of £5 to anybody who would take Oliver Twist off the hands of the workhouse. Chapter 2. Among the Coffins. It wasn't long before someone was found. Business was looking up for Mr. Sowerberry, the parish undertaker. Never before had he known so many funerals, and if he hadn't had such a naturally gloomy face, he might almost have looked happy. But he needed an extra pair of hands, and it didn't take long for the board to agree that Oliver should be apprenticed to him. "Dear me," said the undertaker's wife when she inspected the boy. "He's very small. Still, I suppose he'll grow on our food and drink. But men always thinks they knows best. There, get downstairs, you little bag of bones." With that, Mrs. Sowerberry opened a side door and pushed Oliver down a steep flight of stairs into a damp stone cell, where a grubby-looking girl was sitting. "Here, Charlotte," said Mrs. Sowerberry, who had followed Oliver down. "Give the boy some of the cold bits that we'll put by for the dog, and then show him where to sleep. You don't mind sleeping among the coffins?" she asked, turning to Oliver. "There's nowhere else, anyway, so it don't make any odds if you do mind." You may well imagine that Oliver did mind being left alone to sleep among the coffins. As Oliver lay down on his narrow bed, he found himself wishing that it was his coffin, and that he might go to sleep and never wake up. Wake up he did, though, and for the next few weeks his sad expression, for he didn't have much to be happy about, gave Mr. Sowerberry the idea that he would make a perfect mute. "I don't mean a regular mute to attend grown-up people, my dear," he explained to his wife, "but only the children's funerals. It would have a superb effect." Oliver gained a great deal of experience very quickly, and his success surpassed even Mr. Sowerberry's hopes. But this success, so pleasing to Mr. Sowerberry, was not to Noah Claypole. As a charity boy who had worked for the undertaker for some time, Noah felt his status should put him above that of a common workhouse boy. He had endured the taunts of the more fortunate local boys for long enough. It was his right now to be superior to Oliver. That Oliver had been promoted so successfully to a mute, wearing a hatband and carrying a black stick, while he remained stationary in cap and rough leather trousers, was unbearable. And Noah never failed to treat Oliver badly as a result. One day, Oliver and Noah were alone in the kitchen when Noah decided to have another go at baiting Oliver. First, Noah pulled Oliver's hair, and then he tweaked his ears and pinched him and called him names. Oliver didn't react at all, which annoyed Noah even more. He was determined to make Oliver cry.
"Workus,"
said Noah.
"how's your mother?"
"She's dead," replied Oliver. "Don't you say anything about her to me." Oliver's face turned red as he said this, and Noah, delighted to have got some reaction at last, carried on.
"What did she die of, Workus?"
"Of a broken heart, some of the nurses told me," replied Oliver, breathing heavily.
"Well, I've heard your mother was a regular right down bad 'un."
"What did you say?" asked Oliver, looking up quickly.
"A regular right down bad 'un, Workus,"
replied Noah coolly.
"And it's a good thing she died when she did, or she'd be in prison by now, or transported, or hung, more likely."
Oliver could control himself no more. He jumped up and took Noah by the throat, shaking him so hard his teeth rattled, and then, with all the strength left in him, he hit Noah an almighty blow, knocking him to the ground.
"You'll murder me!"
screamed Noah.
"Charlotte! Missus! The new boy's murdering me! Help! Help!"
Charlotte and Mrs. Sowerberry rushed into the kitchen, and seeing Noah lying on the floor, they both seized Oliver and began hitting him and scratching him before throwing him into the cellar and locking him up.
"Oh, Charlotte!"
cried Mrs. Sowerberry.
"It's a wonder we've not been murdered in our beds. Poor Noah! All but killed, and the master not at home. Quick, Noah, run to Mr. Bumble and tell him to come as fast as he can."
Oliver was still kicking the cellar door when Noah returned with Mr. Bumble carrying his cane. But the sound of Mr. Bumble's impressive voice didn't quiet him or make him repentant. Even when Mr. Sowerberry returned and Oliver was let out of the cellar, he didn't calm down.
"He called my mother names,"
explained Oliver.
"Well, and what if he did?"
said Mrs. Sowerberry.
"She deserved what he said, and worse."
"She didn't," said Oliver.
"It's a lie."
This rudeness to his wife left Mr. Sowerberry no alternative but to punish Oliver severely. He was beaten and then shut up in the back kitchen for the rest of the day with nothing to eat until bedtime, when he went to sleep among the coffins. Chapter 3. The Dodger and the Miser. That night, alone and in the silence of the undertaker's shop, Oliver at last allowed himself to cry. For a long time he hid his face in his hands and wept. But finally, when he stopped, he'd come to a decision. He got up and, as quietly as possible, undid the bolts on the door and walked out into the cold, dark night. He didn't know where he was going, but took the first road he could see and began to run. When daylight broke, he hid behind hedges, and it wasn't until noon that day when he allowed himself to rest and to think where he should try and live. London seemed the best place to try. No one could find him in such a big place, not even Mr. Bumble, and a signpost had said it was only 70 miles away. With renewed enthusiasm, Oliver set off again. 70 miles is a long way to walk, even if you have lots of food and drink, and Oliver had neither. But somehow, by begging and pleading, Oliver managed to find enough food to keep him going, so that by the morning of the 7th day he was limping, cold and sore, into Barnet, on the outskirts of the big city. It was still early, and most of the streets were empty, so Oliver sat down on a doorstep, too tired to walk any further. He stayed there for quite some time, watching the city wake up and the coaches passing by. And he noticed a boy looking at him. He paid no attention to begin with, but as the boy kept on staring, Oliver at last returned his gaze. Seeing this, the boy crossed the street and said to him, "Hello, what's the row?" The boy was about Oliver's age, but one of the oddest-looking boys he'd ever seen. He was snub-nosed and sharp-eyed, small, with bow legs and very dirty, but he had all the airs and graces of a grown-up. He wore a man's coat that was much too big for him, and corduroy trousers with deep pockets. "I'm very hungry and tired," Oliver replied at last, trying not to cry. "I've walked a long way for 7 days." "Walking for 7 days? My! Got any lodgings?" "No." "Money?" "No." The strange boy whistled and put his arms into his pockets as far as they would go. "Well, don't fret your eyelids. I know a 'spectable old gentleman as lives in London what'll give you lodgings for nothing, and never ask for the change. That is, if any gentleman he knows introduces you. The name's Jack Dawkins, by the way, but me friends call me the Artful Dodger." Oliver could hardly believe his luck. It was after 11 o'clock at night when Oliver and his new friend arrived at Saffron Hill in the heart of London City. The narrow streets were so filthy and foul-smelling that Oliver was just thinking about running away again when the Dodger pushed open the door and pulled Oliver into a passage.
"Who's that?"
cried a voice from below.
"Plummy and Slam,"
replied the Dodger. This seemed to be some sort of password, for the light of a candle gleamed at the end of the passage, and a man's face peeped out.
"There's 2 of you," he said. "Who's the t'other one?" "A new pal," said the Dodger, pulling Oliver forward. They climbed some broken stairs into a dark and dirty back room. 4 or 5 boys were sitting round a table, smoking clay pipes and drinking like middle-aged men. Some sausages were cooking on the fire, and standing over them was a very old and wicked-looking man, whose ugly face was partly hidden by a mass of red hair. "This is him, Fagin," said the Dodger. "My friend, Oliver Twist." Fagin grinned and made a low bow. "We are very glad to see you, Oliver. Very," he said. "Dodger, bring a seat for Oliver near the fire. I see you're staring at the pocket handkerchiefs, my dear? There are a lot, ain't there? We've just got them out to wash, that's all." The other boys joined in the noisy laughter, and then they went to supper. Oliver ate his share and drank a glass of hot gin and water which Fagin gave him. Soon after, he felt himself gently lifted onto a sack, where he sank into a deep sleep. When Oliver woke the next morning, everyone had gone except Fagin, who was making coffee in a saucepan. He was not yet properly awake, so that when Fagin called his name, "Oliver," Oliver didn't reply. Very quietly, Fagin took out a small box from a hiding place in the floor. His eyes glistened as he opened the lid and fingered the contents. A magnificent gold watch, rings, brooches, and many other beautiful pieces of jewellery.
Suddenly, Fagin saw that Oliver was watching him. He slammed the lid shut and, picking up the bread knife from the table, demanded furiously, "How long have you been awake? What have you seen? Speak out, boy! Quick, quick!"
"Not long, sir. I'm very sorry, sir," replied
Oliver meekly.
"Did you see any of these pretty things, my dear?"
"Yes, sir."
"Ah," said Fagin, turning rather pale. "They're mine, Oliver, my little property, all I have to live upon in my old age. The folks call me a miser, my dear. That's all."
Oliver went to wash, and by the time he'd finished, the Dodger had returned with one of the boys from the night before, Charlie Bates.
"I hope you've been at work this morning, my dears," said Fagin.
"Hard," replied the Dodger, producing 2 beautifully made wallets. Fagin looked pleased. Then Charlie took out 4 pocket handkerchiefs.
"Well," said Fagin, after inspecting them closely, "they're very good ones, very. Would you like to be able to make handkerchiefs as easy as Charlie, my dear?" Fagin said, turning to Oliver.
"Very much indeed, if you'll teach me, sir," replied Oliver, which, to Oliver's surprise, made Master Bates laugh so much he nearly choked. After breakfast, Fagin and the 2 boys played a very curious game. Fagin placed a snuff-box in one trouser pocket, a wallet in the other, and a watch in his waistcoat pocket. Then he trotted up and down the room with a stick, pretending to be a grand gentleman taking a walk. The 2 boys followed closely, hiding quickly every time Fagin turned round. At last the Dodger trod upon the old man's toes, whilst Charlie stumbled against him, and in that moment, quick as a flash, they took from him the various contents of his pockets. When they'd played this game many times, a couple of young ladies arrived. Bet and Nancy were both rather untidy and not exactly pretty, but Oliver liked them. They stayed a long time and had a few drinks before Charlie suggested the 4 of them go out.
"It's a nice life, isn't it, Oliver?" said Fagin when they were alone. "Now, see if you can take my handkerchief out of my pocket without my feeling it."
Fagin was delighted when Oliver successfully produced the handkerchief.
"You'll be the greatest man of our time," he said, patting Oliver on the head.
Oliver couldn't think what playing a funny game had to do with becoming a great man, but supposed that the old gentleman must know best. For many days Oliver stayed in the dark room, sometimes picking the embroidered initials out of handkerchiefs with a needle as he'd been shown, and sometimes playing the pocket game. But Oliver longed for fresh air, and he begged Fagin to be allowed to go out and work with the Dodger and Charlie Bates. At last, one morning, Fagin decided to grant Oliver's wish, and Oliver was told he might go with his friends. The 3 boys set out, the Dodger with his coat sleeves tucked up as usual, Master Bates sauntering along with his hands in his pockets, and Oliver between them, wondering where they were going and what work they were going to do. Chapter 4. Stop Thief. The Dodger and Charlie strolled so slowly through the streets that Oliver began to wonder if they were going to do any work at all. The Dodger had a nasty habit of pulling the caps off the heads of small boys, and Charlie casually pilfered apples and onions from the market stalls they passed. Oliver was just thinking of going back to Fagin's when the Dodger suddenly stopped.
"See that gent at the bookstall?"
he said to Charlie.
"He'll do."
Not knowing what they were talking about, Oliver watched in amazement as the 2 boys walked stealthily across the road towards the gentleman. Then, to his horror, the Dodger plunged his hand into the old gentleman's pocket and took out a handkerchief. He handed it to Charlie, and then they both ran away round the corner at top speed. Suddenly the whole mystery of the handkerchiefs and the watch and the jewels and Fagin became clear. Oliver stood for a moment, the blood tingling through his veins. Then, confused and frightened, he started to run as fast as he could. At that same moment, the old gentleman, realizing his handkerchief had gone, turned round. Seeing Oliver running away, he immediately chased after him, the book still in his hand, shouting, "Stop, thief!" The Dodger and Bates, unwilling to attract attention, had merely stepped into a doorway. They heard the cry and saw Oliver running and shouted, "Stop, thief!" too, joining in the chase like good citizens. "Stop, thief! Stop, thief!" At the sound, the shopkeeper left his counter, the butcher threw down his tray. Away they ran, helter-skelter, yelling, screaming, and the streets echoed with the sound. Like an animal being hunted, Oliver ran panting with exhaustion, his pursuers gaining upon him every instant. Stopped at last. He was down upon the pavement, and the crowd eagerly gathered round him, struggling to catch a glimpse. Oliver lay, covered with mud and dust, and bleeding from the mouth, looking wildly round at the faces surrounding him.
"Yes," said the gentleman, "I'm afraid this is the boy."
A police officer, who is generally the last person to arrive in such cases, at that moment seized Oliver by the collar. "It wasn't me, sir," Oliver cried passionately. "It was two other boys. They must be here somewhere."
"Oh, no, they ain't,"
said the officer. This was true, as the Dodger and Charlie Bates had slipped away down a convenient lane.
"Come on, get up."
The officer dragged Oliver along, and the gentleman walked with them. Oliver was taken to the nearest police station and locked up in a cell. The old gentleman looked almost as sad as Oliver when the key turned in the lock. "There's something in the boy's face," he said to himself thoughtfully. "Something that touches me. It reminds me of someone. But who can it be?" He searched his memory, calling up face after face before his mind's eye. "No," he sighed, shaking his head. "It must be my imagination." Burying his head in his book, he sat down to wait for Oliver's case to be heard. He didn't have to wait long. Oliver was soon brought trembling before the magistrate. Mr. Fang was a thin, balding man with a red face from too much drink. He was also very bad-tempered.
"Who are you?"
he said, scowling at the old gentleman. "My name, sir, is Brownlow."
"Officer,"
said Mr. Fang.
"what's the fella charged with?"
"He's not charged at all, your worship. He is accusing this boy of pickpocketing," the officer replied, pointing at Oliver. Oliver looked so pale and so ill, and Mr. Brownlow was by now so sure that he couldn't be guilty, that he tried to explain to the magistrate that he hadn't actually seen Oliver steal anything. But Mr. Fang refused to listen, and when Oliver failed to speak up for himself, being too confused and faint, he sentenced him all the same.
"He stands committed for 3 months. Hard labour, of course."
The room was about to be cleared when an elderly man rushed in.
Stop, don't take him away," he cried breathlessly. "I saw it all. I keep the bookstall. You must hear me."
Very reluctantly, Mr. Fang heard the details of the robbery and how the bookseller had seen 2 other boys steal Mr. Brownlow's handkerchief. He had no choice but to release Oliver. Outside, Mr. Brownlow was on the point of going home when he saw Oliver. He was bathed in sweat, his face was a deadly white, and his whole body was trembling. "Poor boy, poor boy," said Mr. Brownlow, bending over him. "Call a coach, somebody, quickly." The coach arrived, and having carefully laid Oliver on one seat, The old gentleman got in, and the two of them were driven away. It took them to Mr. Brownlow's smart house in a shady street near Pentonville. Here Oliver was at once taken to bed, where for many days he lay ill with a fever, unaware of the kindness that was at last being shown to him. As soon as Oliver had been caught, the Dodger and Charlie ran as fast as they could through a maze of narrow streets until, out of breath, they reached Fagin's house. Fagin was sitting over the fire with a sausage and a small loaf tin in his left hand, and a pewter pot on the trivet, when they opened the door. "Where's Oliver? Where's the boy?" he demanded with a menacing look. And when neither boy replied, Fagin seized the Dodger by the collar. "Speak out, or I'll throttle you." "The police have got him," said the Dodger sullenly. "Now let me go." And he slipped out of his big coat, leaving it empty in Fagin's hands. Fagin picked up the pot and hurled it in the direction of the boy. It narrowly missed a man who was just coming in through the door. "What the blazes is going on?" growled the man. "What's this all about, Fagin?" The man who spoke was stoutly built and aged about 35. He wore a black velvet coat, dirty breeches, a brown hat, and a soiled Belcher handkerchief tied round his neck, with which he wiped beer from his face. His chin sported a beard of 3 days' growth, and he had clearly been in a recent fight, for one of his scowling eyes was black and swollen. A white dog, with a scratched and torn face, skulked in after him. The man kicked the dog into a corner where he lay quietly, obviously used to such treatment. "What's going on?" repeated the man. Fagin looked nervously at Bill Sikes as the boys repeated the story of what had happened to Oliver. "I'm afraid," said Fagin, "that the boy may say something that will get us into trouble." "That's very likely," said Sikes with an evil grin. "The game's up for you, Fagin." "And I'm afraid," continued Fagin, "that if the game was up with us, it might be up for a good many others. Things might be rather worse for you than they would for me, my dear." Sikes turned fiercely on Fagin, but the old gentleman merely shrugged his shoulders. There was a long pause before Sikes finally muttered, "Somebody's got to find out what happened at the magistrate's office." Everyone nodded, but no one wanted to go near a police station under any circumstances. At that moment, Bet and Nancy walked in. "Nancy, my dear," said Fagin in a soothing manner, "you'll go, won't you?" "She'll go, Fagin," answered Sikes for her. Having no choice, Nancy set out with a clean white apron tied over her gown to find out what she could about Oliver. No one was pleased when Nancy returned with the news that Oliver had been taken to the home of the old gentleman at the bookstall and not charged with anything. "We must know where he is, my dears," said Fagin, greatly upset. "I must have him found. Go out, all of you, and find him for me, and then I'll know what to do with him." Then he muttered to himself, "If he means to blab about us to his new friends, we may stop his mouth yet." Chapter 5. Mr. Brownlow's Trust. When at last Oliver woke, he was very weak and thin. "Where am I?" he asked feebly. The curtain around his bed was quickly drawn, and there stood a motherly old lady. "Hush, my dear," said Mrs. Bedwin softly. "You must be very quiet, or you'll be ill again." And she placed Oliver's head gently upon the pillow. The doctor seemed satisfied with the boy's progress, and after 3 days Oliver was able to sit in a wheelchair, well propped up with pillows. Later, Mrs. Bedwin carried Oliver downstairs to a room and sat him by the fireside. "Are you fond of pictures, dear?" she asked Oliver, seeing him gaze at a portrait on the wall. "Who is that pretty lady?" he asked. "She looks so sad. It feels as if she wanted to speak to me, but couldn't." Bedwin didn't know, but worried that the picture was upsetting Oliver, she wheeled his chair round so that he wouldn't see it. As she did this, there was a knock on the door, and Mr. Brownlow came in. "How do you feel, my dear?" he asked kindly. "Very happy, sir," replied Oliver, "and very grateful indeed, sir, for your goodness to me." "Good boy." He was about to say something more when his eyes fell upon the portrait above Oliver's head. "Gracious me, Bedwin, look at this!" He pointed to the picture and then to the boy's face. There was its living copy. The eyes, the head, the mouth, every feature was the same. Oliver soon recovered completely, and the days went by happily and quickly. Mr. Brownlow bought him new clothes, and everything he could want was provided for him. It seemed to Oliver that he was in heaven itself. One afternoon, Mr. Brownlow was showing Oliver some books in his study when Mr. Grimwig was announced. "Show my friend in," said Mr. Brownlow with a smile. Once Oliver had left to ask Mrs. Bedwin to bring some tea, Mr. Brownlow asked his friend what he thought of Oliver. "He's a nice-looking boy, is he not?"
"I don't know," said Mr. Grimwig bad-temperedly. "What do you know about the boy? Who is he? What is he? How can you tell if he's honest?"
The chance to test Oliver's honesty came sooner than expected. A boy had delivered some books without waiting for payment, or for the books that Mr. Brownlow wished to return. At once, Mr. Grimwig suggested that Oliver should go. Oliver himself was so eager to be of help that Mr. Brownlow had to allow him, despite his worries for the boy's safety. So, armed with the books and a £5 note, Oliver set off for the bookstall, waving as he went. "Let me see," said Mr. Brownlow. "He'll be back in 20 minutes at the latest."
"Oh, you really expect him back, do you?" said Mr. Grimwig. "The boy has a new suit of clothes on his back, a set of valuable books under his arm, and a £5 note in his pocket. He'll join his old friends the thieves and laugh at you. If the boy comes back, I'll eat my head."
On his way to the bookstall, Oliver was just thinking how lucky he was when he was startled by a young woman screaming out, "Oh, my dear brother!" As he looked up to see what was going on, a pair of arms were thrown tightly round his neck. "Let go of me!" cried Oliver, struggling. "I've found him!" cried the young woman. "Oh, Oliver, Oliver, you naughty boy! Come home now."
"What's the matter, ma'am?"
asked a passer-by. "He ran away almost a month ago and joined a set of thieves," the young woman replied. "He broke his poor mother's heart." "It's not true," said Oliver desperately. "I don't know you." Then he saw the woman's face. "Why, it's Nancy!" he exclaimed in astonishment. "You see, he does know me," cried Nancy. At the same time, Bill Sykes burst out of a pub, his dog at his heels. "Come, what's this? Young Oliver, come home to your mother. Here, Bullseye," he said to the dog. "Mind him." Still weak from his illness and terrified by the growling dog, Oliver could do nothing. He was dragged through a maze of dark, narrow streets, utterly helpless. The afternoon had turned into a dark and foggy night when at last they came to a familiar passage, and Oliver was pushed roughly into Fagin's lodgings. "Delighted to see you looking so well, my dear," said Fagin, making a mock bow. "Dodger will find you another suit. You don't want to spoil your best one." The Dodger smiled as he fished the £5 note from Oliver's pocket.
"That's mine," said Sikes quickly. "Mine and Nancy's for all our trouble in kidnapping the boy. Keep the books if you like."
Oliver looked dismayed. "They belong to the old gentleman," he cried. "He's been so kind to me. Please send the books and the money back. You can keep me here as long as you like, but please send them back. He'll think I stole them."
"You're right, Oliver. He will think you've stolen them," chuckled Fagin, rubbing his hands together. "Couldn't be better."
Oliver jumped suddenly to his feet and ran from the room, shrieking for help. But it was no use. He was quickly caught and brought back into the room. Fagin picked up a jagged piece of wood from the fireplace and hit Oliver across the shoulder.
"That'll teach you to run away," he said.
He was about to hit him again when Nancy grabbed the wood and threw it into the fire with a force that sent some of the glowing coals whirling into the room. "Let the boy alone!" she cried. "He'll be a thief, a liar, and all that's bad from now on, just like the rest of us. What more do you want? I wish I'd had no part in kidnapping Oliver." Tearing her hair and dress in passion, Nancy rushed at Fagin, but Sikes grabbed her wrists. Nancy struggled in vain, and then fainted. Fagin looked relieved as Nancy was laying down in a corner.
"Charlie, show Oliver to bed," he said, wiping his forehead.
Master Bates locked Oliver in a small dark room, but Oliver was too tired to care. Sick and weary, he soon fell sound asleep. Chapter 6. The Robbery. The next day Fagin gave Oliver a long lecture.
"How could you be so ungrateful, my dear? And after all we have done for you in giving you a home."
His description of how a boy he once knew who told tales to the police was hanged on false evidence made Oliver's blood run cold. Fagin, smiling hideously, patted Oliver on the head and went out, locking the room behind him. And so Oliver remained for the rest of that day and for many days afterwards. Lonely and unhappy, Oliver often thought about Mr. Brownlow and wondered what he would be thinking. Had he known the truth, that Mr. Brownlow, on advertising for news of Oliver, had met Mr. Bumble, that the beadle had given the worst account of Oliver's character, and that following this Mr. Brownlow had forbidden Oliver's name ever to be mentioned again, Oliver would have been in even greater despair. It was a chill, damp, windy night when Fagin left his den. He crept along the slimy, dark alleyways like a lizard until he reached a street lit only by a single lamp. Here he found the house that he wanted. Nancy and Bill were sitting by the fire when Fagin came in. Pulling up a chair, Fagin began to talk about business.
"When's the job at Chertsey to be done?" he asked Bill.
"Not at all," replied Sikes, "unless you can find me a boy small enough to break into the house."
"Ah,"
sighed Fagin, but seeing Nancy, hesitated before saying any more. "Go on," said Sikes. "You can trust Nancy. She ain't one to blab."
"Well then," continued
Fagin in a hoarse whisper,
"Oliver's the boy for you. He's small, and it's time he began to work for his bread."
It didn't take long to persuade Sikes to use Oliver for the job, especially after several drinks, and so, to Fagin's delight, it was agreed that Nancy would fetch Oliver the next evening. "What do you want me to do?" asked Oliver when Nancy came for him.
"Oh, nothing harmful,"
replied Nancy. But Oliver could see that Nancy was upset. He knew that she cared for him, and for a moment he thought about begging her to help him. As if Nancy could read his thoughts, she whispered, "As soon as I can help you, I will. But now you must come with me. Give me your hand." So Oliver took Nancy's hand and followed her to the house Fagin had visited the night before.
"Did he come quiet?"
asked Sikes when they got in.
"Like a lamb,"
said Nancy. Sikes picked up a pistol and put it to Oliver's head.
"If you say one word when you're outside with me, I'll shoot you, understand?"
End of side 1. Oliver Twist, side 2. Oliver was woken at 5:30 the next morning. It was still dark. Nancy didn't look at Oliver as Sikes pulled him out of the house. He had to run to keep up with Sikes as they crossed London, until at last they were given a lift in an empty cart. They passed several milestones on their way out of town, and Oliver wondered where they were going. Late that night they reached a large ruined house. It looked empty, but on pushing the door, a loud voice welcomed them.
"Bill, my boy, I was afraid you weren't coming. Who's this with you?"
"One of Fagin's boys," replied Sikes. "Now, Mr. Crackit, give us something to eat and drink while we're waiting."
This done, they slept for some time until Toby Crackit jumped up, declaring it was 1:30. In an instant they'd collected all the tools they needed for their work, a pair of pistols, keys, and a crowbar. The night had turned foggy as they hurried through a deserted little town. The church bell struck 2, and they walked even faster, until they stopped in front of a detached house surrounded by a wall. Toby climbed it in a twinkling.
"The boy next,"
he said, and before Oliver knew it, he was hoisted over the wall, followed by Sikes. And now, for the first time, Oliver understood with dawning horror the reason they were here. Robbery, if not murder. He clasped his hands together.
"Oh, please don't make me steal," he begged. "I promise never to tell anyone anything."
Sikes swore and cocked his pistol. Toby knocked it from his grasp, put his hand over the boy's mouth, and dragged him towards the house, hissing,
"I'll kill you myself if you say another word."
Noiselessly, Sikes forced open a little window at the back of the house.
"Now, listen, Oliver," he whispered. "I'm going to put you through there. Go along the hall and open the door to let us in. Take this light and go. Now."
Oliver, though deadly afraid, had made up his mind to raise the alarm once inside. Filled with this brave thought, he began to climb in.
"Come back!"
Sikes suddenly cried aloud.
"Back! Back!"
Oliver dropped the lantern, too terrified to move. He saw 2 half-dressed men at the top of the stairs. Then a flash, a loud noise, a smoke, a crash somewhere. He staggered back. Sikes grabbed Oliver and dragged him through the window.
"They've hit him! Look how he bleeds!"
he shouted. There came the loud ringing of the bell, and men began shouting. Oliver felt himself being carried away.
"Help me carry the boy!"
Sikes shouted to Crackit. But Mr. Toby Crackit had no wish to be caught.
"It's all up, Bill! Drop the kid and run!"
They could hear the sound of dogs after them, and Sikes knew Crackit was right. He lay Oliver in a ditch and ran. Oliver would have been surprised to see the effect the news of his misfortunes had on Fagin. When Crackit confessed to the evil old man that they had left Oliver, not knowing whether he was alive or dead, Fagin tore his hair out, rushing from room to room, crying, "The boy's worth hundreds of pounds to me!" He would have been even more surprised if he had heard Fagin talking about him earnestly to a man whom he called Monks. Why was this man Monks interested in his fate? But Oliver didn't know these things. For a long while he lay unconscious in the ditch where Sikes had left him. Even the heavy rain didn't stir him. And when at last Oliver did wake, the pain in his arm was so great and he felt so weak that he could hardly move. but he knew he must if he wanted to live. His head dizzy and his body shaking and trembling with cold and exhaustion, Oliver staggered forward, not knowing where he was going. At last he reached a road, and looking about him, caught sight of a house. Summoning up all his remaining strength, he stumbled towards it. But as he came closer, he recognized the house. It was the same one they'd tried to rob the night before. His first thought was to run, but he had no strength left, and nowhere to run to. He tottered across the lawn, knocked faintly at the door, and then sank to the ground. You might think that Oliver's luck couldn't have been much worse, to have arrived helpless at the very house that he'd been forced to break into, but this time luck was kind to him. The house belonged to Mrs. Maylie, a kind old lady who lived there with her beautiful young niece, Rose. Oliver was taken upstairs, and a doctor called for.
"Surely this poor child cannot be one of the robbers,"
exclaimed the old lady, looking at Oliver's sweet face as he lay sleeping.
"He's so young,"
gasped Rose with tears in her eyes.
"Oh, Aunt, he may never have known a mother's love, just as I would not have done if you had not given me a home and cared for me like the mother I never knew. Please, do not let him be dragged off to prison."
"My dear child," said the old lady, "do you think I would harm a hair of his head?" So these two gentle ladies convinced their servants that Oliver had nothing to do with the robbery, and asked them to send away the Bow Street runners who'd been called in to investigate. And when Oliver was well enough to tell them his sad story, they were even more glad they could help this orphan child. Chapter 7. Faces from the Past. As the weeks went by, Oliver grew stronger and happier, but yet he couldn't help feeling a little guilty too. If only he could find Mr. Brownlow and the kind Mrs. Bedwin who'd looked after him before, he could explain his sudden disappearance, and he knew they'd be happy for his good fortune now. When at last Oliver told Rose what was troubling him, she arranged for him to go to London as soon as he was well enough. And when the day arrived, Oliver could barely contain his excitement. So you may imagine his disappointment when, on finding Mr. Brownlow's house in Pentonville, he discovered that Mr. Brownlow had sold up and moved to the West Indies. Oliver believed his chance of clearing his name had vanished. However, the Maylies' loving care soon helped ease his sadness. They moved to a pretty cottage in the country, and here Oliver spent happy hours among the green hills and rich woods, watching the spring flowers emerge. Rose gave him lessons every day, and he was an eager pupil. Life was so peaceful and tranquil that Oliver almost forgot the horror of his time with Fagin in London. But Fagin hadn't forgotten about Oliver. Quite by chance, Oliver had been seen by monks in the nearby town, and the news that Oliver was still alive made Fagin determined to get him back. One evening, Oliver was studying in his room and finding it hard to concentrate. The evening sunlight was making him feel drowsy, and soon his head began to nod. In this state of half-sleep, he dreamt he saw two faces appear at the window.
"It is him, sure enough. Now we know where he is. Let's go."
He dreamt he heard the hideous old man whisper,
"I could never mistake him, were he buried 50 feet under the ground, if only he was."
The other man seemed to say this with such hatred that Oliver awoke with a start. And it wasn't a dream. There at the window, so close he could almost have touched him, was Fagin. With him was a strange man, Monks, whom Oliver didn't know, except to sense that he was an enemy. Oliver screamed for help, and the men vanished. But although the servants searched the grounds, They could find no trace of them. Back at the workhouse where Oliver was born, Mr. Bumble found that his life had taken a turn for the worse. He had been married 2 months to Mrs. Corney, the matron, and she was always nagging him, even though he had been promoted to master of the workhouse. One evening, instead of going home, he wandered into a public house. There was only one other man drinking there. "I've seen you before, I think," said Monks. "Weren't you the beadle round here once?"
"I was,"
said Mr. Bumble in some surprise. Monks smiled and ordered more drinks. "Well, this is a lucky meeting, for I came down here to find you. I want some information, and I'll pay you for it." Mr. Bumble listened keenly. Monks wanted to find the old woman who had nursed Oliver's mother. The woman had since died, but when Bumble mentioned that his wife had attended the old woman on her deathbed, Monks looked very interested. They agreed to meet again. At 9 o'clock the following evening, Mr. and Mrs. Bumble made their way towards a group of seedy little houses near the river. The area was a well-known haunt of criminals. It began to pour with rain, and thunder wasn't far away. A small door opened, and there stood Monks. He showed Mr. and Mrs. Bumble in, and led them up a ladder to a dimly lit room. "Now," he said, addressing Mrs. Bumble impatiently, "tell me what you know about the old woman. What did she say before she died?" Mrs. Bumble refused to talk until Monks had paid her £25. Then, as a violent thunderstorm shook the house, the matron began her story.
"Old Sally confessed to me on her deathbed that she had stolen something from Oliver's mother. She died before she could tell me more, but she was clasping a scrap of dirty paper."
"What did it say?" cried Monks, stretching forward.
"Nothing. It was a pawnbroker's ticket. I took it to the shop and exchanged the ticket for the goods. Here,"
she added, throwing a small leather bag on the table. Monks tore the bag open with trembling hands. Inside was a gold locket and a wedding ring with the word Agnes engraved on the inside.
"What will you do with it?"
asked Mrs. Bumble.
"Can it be used against me?"
"Never," replied Monks, "nor against me either. Look." With these words he threw back a large trapdoor at Mr. Bumble's feet. Underneath was the swirling river, swollen by heavy rain. Monks tied a weight to the leather packet and dropped it into the water. "There," he said, closing the trapdoor. "It's gone. And now it's time for us to go. No one need know anything about what happened here tonight." Chapter 8. A Secret Message. Back in London, Nancy was sitting sewing by the window, while Bill Sikes lay ill in bed with his dog by his side. Illness hadn't improved Sikes' temper, and he struck Nancy as she tried to help him out of bed. At that moment Fagin looked in, followed by the Dodger and Charlie Bates. Dodger produced a bundle containing some food and a bottle of wine. Although the food was welcome, Sikes was still angry. "That's all very well, Fagin, but it's money I need." "I haven't a penny on me," replied Fagin. "Then you've got lots at home. Nancy shall go and fetch it while I rest here." After a great deal of haggling and squabbling, Fagin agreed to advance Sikes £3. Fagin and the boys returned homewards, accompanied by Nancy. "Now," said Fagin as they reached his lodgings, "I'll go and get you that money, Nancy." Fagin lit a candle and was about to go upstairs when a visitor arrived. It was Monks. Gesturing to Nancy that he wouldn't be long, Fagin took Monks upstairs to talk privately. Nancy slipped off her shoes and crept to the door, listening with breathless interest. After about a quarter of an hour, she stole downstairs just before the two men came out of the room. With great reluctance, Fagin handed the money to Nancy, and she left. The next evening, Sikes was still weak from fever and lying in bed. Nancy gave him several drinks laced with laudanum, a powerful sleeping drug, and sat with him until he fell asleep. Stooping softly over him, she kissed the robber's lips, then, dressed in her bonnet and shawl, hurried from the house. A watchman was crying, "9:30!" She brushed quickly past him down a dark passage and increased her pace. It was after 11 o'clock by the time Nancy reached her destination, a family hotel in a quiet street near Hyde Park. Nancy hesitated before stepping into the hall. "Now, young woman," said a smartly dressed female, "who do you want to see?" "Miss Rose Maylie. I must see her," Nancy begged. A man appeared and pushed Nancy towards the door. "Take yourself off," he said disdainfully. "Not until you deliver this message," exclaimed Nancy, "and let me hear the answer." The man reluctantly proceeded upstairs, and Nancy remained, pale and anxious, waiting for the reply. Chapter 9. Oliver's Return. She didn't have to wait long. "Please tell me why you wanted to see me," said Rose Maylie sweetly when Nancy was shown to her room. "I'm the girl that dragged little Oliver back to old Fagin's house on the night he left Mr. Brownlow's house," replied Nancy. "I am the girl who lives among the thieves, and there are those who would murder me if they knew I was here. Do you know a man called Monks?" "No," said Rose in bewilderment. "Well, he knows you and where you were staying. It's because I heard him tell Fagin that I was able to find you. I first overheard Monks talking to Fagin some time ago, on the night when Oliver was forced to break into your house. They were striking a bargain. Monks agreed to give Fagin some money if he could get Oliver back and make him into a thief. I wasn't able to hear any more then, but last night Monks came again. He said that although he'd got the boy's money, he was afraid of Oliver finding out about his father's will and would gladly kill his brother if he could." "His brother?" gasped Rose. "Oh, no." "Those were his words. When he spoke of you and the other lady, he said you'd give thousands of pounds to know who Oliver really was. I must go back now. It's getting late." "Back? But if you stay here, I'll help you, and then you'll be safe." "I want to go back," said Nancy. "It's hard to explain, but among the men I've told you about, there's one who needs me. I cannot leave him." "How shall I find you, then? This mystery must be investigated to help Oliver." "Every Sunday night, from 11 to 12, I will walk on London Bridge if I'm still alive. And now I must go. God bless you, sweet lady." Rose found it difficult to sleep that night, wondering what she would do about Nancy's visit. The next morning she was still anxiously considering the matter when Oliver rushed into her room. "I've seen him! I've seen him!" Oliver cried. "I've seen Mr. Brownlow!" Oliver had written down the address where Mr. Brownlow lived, and Rose arranged for a hansom cab to take them to the house immediately. Once there, she left Oliver in the cab while she went to introduce herself to Mr. Brownlow and to explain everything that had happened to Oliver. "He's waiting in a cab at the door," she said. The old gentleman ran down the stairs to the cab and brought Oliver into the house. When Mrs. Bedwin entered the room, Oliver flung his arms round her. "My sweet, innocent boy," she cried. "I knew you'd come back." While Oliver and Mrs. Bedwin chatted happily, Rose spoke privately to Mr. Brownlow about her meeting with Nancy, for she knew she could trust him, and that he would know what to do. Chapter 10. A Spy in the Mist. On Sunday night, Nancy was sitting with Bill and Fagin when the church bell struck 11. "An hour before midnight," said Sikes, raising the blind to look out of the window. "Dark and heavy it is, too. A good night for business." "Ah," sighed Fagin. "What a pity, Bill, my dear, that there's none ready to be done." While the two men were busy talking, Nancy quietly put on her bonnet and started to leave the room. "Where do you think you're going at this time of night?" cried Sikes. "I just want a breath of fresh air." "Put your head out the window, then," Sikes replied, locking the door before pulling Nancy's bonnet off her head and throwing it across the room. "Tell him to let me go, Fagin," Nancy begged before turning to Sikes again. "Let me go, just for an hour." She carried on in this way, struggling and crying until the clock struck 12, and then, as if exhausted by her efforts, she stopped. As Fagin walked towards his house, he pondered Nancy's strange behaviour, wondering why she'd been so keen to get away. It crossed his mind that Nancy had grown tired of Bill and his brutal ways, and had found a new friend. The idea pleased him. Nancy must know that she'd never be safe from Bill's anger if she left him, so perhaps she'd agree to poison Bill instead. In a stroke, the man whom Fagin had grown to fear for what he knew about Fagin's long life of crime would be dead, and Nancy would be in his power. Nothing could be better. But first, he must discover who Nancy's new friend was. Fagin lost no time in finding a spy. He was unable to call upon the Artful Dodger, for the law had finally caught up with him, and he'd been arrested for picking pockets. The person Fagin chose was Noah Claypole, the very same individual who had made Oliver's life such a misery at Sowerberry's. Noah had robbed the undertaker, taking the money in the till, and run away to London. There he'd come to the attention of Fagin, who was always on the lookout for useful associates. For the next 6 nights Noah sat ready to follow Nancy. But each night Fagin was disappointed, as Nancy didn't move. On the 7th night his luck changed. It was a Sunday. "She's moving tonight, I'm sure," said Fagin to his spy. "The man she's afraid of is away till daybreak. Come quickly." They watched as Nancy came out of the door and looked nervously around before moving on. Noah Claypole followed her. A mist hung over the river on that dark night, deepening the red glow of the fires that burned upon the small boats moored along the banks. The heavy bell of St. Paul's tolled 12. Midnight had come upon the crowded city. Nancy saw Rose, accompanied by a grey-haired gentleman, get out of a carriage and walk towards the bridge. She went up to them and whispered, "Not here. It's too public. Come down the steps over there." And she pointed to some stairs leading down to the river. "That's better," she said when they were hidden in shadows. "Bill stopped me from going out last Sunday, and tonight I feel very afraid. I've had horrible thoughts of death, and a fear that has made me burn as if I was on fire has been upon me all day." "Imagination," soothed the gentleman. "Now, we want to find Monks and make him tell us his secret. But I must tell you that if we cannot get him, it is very important you tell me how to catch Fagin." "Fagin?" cried the girl. "Oh, no, I could never do that, for even though he's been a devil to me, I will never give him up. I've led a bad life too, and I won't tell on people who never told on me, however bad they are." "Then," said the gentleman quickly, "tell me how to get Monks." "But what if he turns against the others?" "We only want to learn what the man knows about Oliver," said the gentleman, "and I promise Monks will never know how we found out about him." Reassured, Nancy told him in a low voice where Monks could be found, and described what he looked like. "He's tall, with a dark face and sunken eyes. On his throat there's a broad red mark like a burn," cried the gentleman. "Do you know him?" said the girl in surprise. "I think so," he replied. "You have been most helpful. Tell me how we can help you in return." Nancy began to cry. "There's nothing you can do. I'm chained to my old life, though I hate it now. I cannot leave it." Then, looking anxiously around, she said goodbye and disappeared into the night, followed some minutes later by the astonished listener, who crept stealthily from his hiding place and darted away to Fagin's house. Dawn hadn't yet broken, but Fagin sat wide awake in his lair. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face pale and distorted. He couldn't believe what Noah Claypole, his spy, had told him. He felt utter hatred for Nancy, the girl who had dared to blab to strangers. He refused to believe that she wouldn't betray him, and he was bitterly disappointed that his plans to rid himself of Sikes had failed. Fear of detection and ruin and death consumed him. At last Fagin heard what he'd been waiting for. The bell rang, and Sikes came through the door, carrying a bundle of stolen goods, which he threw down on the table. "There's something you should know, Bill," said Fagin, and he woke Noah so that he could repeat his story. Sikes listened with a growing anger. Finally he rushed from the room. "Bill! Bill!" cried Fagin after him. "You won't be too violent, Bill?" Sikes said nothing, but pulled open the door and dashed out into the silent streets. Chapter 11. The Murderer. Nancy was lying asleep in her bed when Bill entered the room and woke her. "It's you, Bill," said the girl happily. Then she saw with alarm the look on his face. "What's the matter, Bill? Why are you looking at me like that?" "You know what the matter is, you she-devil. You were watched tonight. Every word you said was heard." "Then you'll know that I didn't betray you. I'd never do that, Bill. I love you," she cried desperately. But the robber wasn't listening. He grasped his pistol and was about to shoot when he realized the noise would be sure to give him away. Instead, he beat her upturned face with it. She staggered and fell. Shutting out the sight with his hand, Sikes seized a heavy club and struck her down again. He sat in the corner, afraid to move. Even when the sun came through the window, lighting up Nancy's dead body, he didn't stir until he could bear the sight no more. He threw a rug over her, washed himself, and turned out of the door, dragging his dog with him. Sikes only knew that he had to get out of London. All day he walked, and when he reached the countryside he carried on, hiding in ditches and behind hedges when he could. By 9 o'clock that evening he was exhausted, and his dog was limping. But no matter how far behind he'd left London, he couldn't escape from the image of Nancy's dead body. He seemed to see her shadow in the gloom, and hear her clothes rustle in the leaves. She haunted him, following him wherever he went. Finding shelter in a shed, he tried to sleep, but even when he closed his eyes, he could see her dead eyes in his mind. And suddenly, he heard upon the night wind the noise of shouting. Springing to his feet, Sikes rushed into the open air. The broad sky seemed on fire. The shouts grew louder, and he could hear the cry of "Fire!" mingled with the clanging of the engine pumps and the crackling of flames. Darting through the undergrowth, Sikes came upon the scene. Half-dressed figures were tearing to and fro, some trying to drag the frightened horses from the stables, others coming laden from the burning building. Immediately, Sikes plunged himself into the throng of people, working at the pumps, hurrying through smoke and flames to help put the fire out. And when morning dawned, and nothing but blackened ruins remained, Sikes had neither bruise nor scratch. Some firemen called to him to share their drink. He could hear others nearby talking about the London murder. He hurried off and walked till he almost dropped upon the ground. Waking after an uneasy sleep, Sikes decided to return to London. At least there'll be somebody to talk to there, he thought. And London's a good hiding place. They'll never think to look for me there. I'll force some ready money out of Fagin and get away to France. Then he looked at Bullseye. People would be looking for him too, he realised. If they saw his dog, they'd find him. Sikes decided to drown him, and walked on looking for a pond and a heavy stone. But as if Bullseye knew what his master was planning, he ran off when the robber called. Sikes whistled again and again, but no dog appeared. After some time, Sikes gave up and set off again for London. Down by the River Thames in the south of London, there is a place called Jacob's Island. Here, the warehouses are empty and falling down, and the houses have no owners. In this dirtiest, roughest part of London, only the poorest and most desperate people live. It was here, in an upstairs room in a derelict house, that 3 men sat talking. "When did the police get Fagin?" asked Toby Crackit. "At dinner time," replied one of the others. "Charlie Bates and I made a lucky escape up the chimney." "And Bet?" "When she saw Nancy's body, she started screaming and raving, so they put her in a straitjacket and took her off to hospital." The men sat in silence, contemplating the terrible events of the last couple of days, when Bullseye bounded into the room. "What's that dog doing here?" exclaimed Crackit. "I hope this don't mean Sikes is coming." Some time later, Sikes did appear, or the ghost of Sikes, for his eyes were sunken in his pale head and his cheeks were hollow. No one said anything, till a few moments later Charlie Bates came in. "Charlie," said Sikes, going towards him. "Don't come any closer, you murderer," answered the boy with horror on his face. "I'm not afraid of you. Kill me if you like, but if the police come here, I'll give you up." They began to fight when lights appeared below. A crowd was gathering, and someone knocked at the door. "Help! He's here!" cried Charlie. "Break the door down!" "Get me a rope or I'll do 3 more murders," Sikes shouted at the other 3 men. The crowd by now had turned into a mob of angry people, baying for Sikes' blood. A huge cry went up when they saw Sikes climb out onto the roof. "They have him now!" cheered a man on the nearest bridge. "Hey!" There was another roar from the crowd. Urged on by the noise below him, Sikes set his foot against a chimney stack and tied one end of the rope tightly round it. With the other, he tied a noose to let himself down to the ground. But at the very instant he put the loop over his head to slip under his arms, the murderer looked up and gave a terrified yell. "The eyes again!" he screeched. Staggering, as if struck by lightning, he lost his balance and fell, with the noose around his neck. There was a sudden jerk, and Sikes was dead, his body swinging lifeless against the wall. Bullseye, till now hidden, ran forward, howling, and jumped towards Sikes. Missing his aim, he too fell to his death. Chapter 12. A New Life. Now that Sikes was dead and Fagin lay condemned in prison, Oliver could almost begin to start his life again free from fear. But there was still one man he had to meet who would solve the mystery of his identity. And so it was, not 2 days after Sikes had died, that Oliver found himself going with Mrs. Maylie and Rose and Mrs. Bedwin to the town where he was born. There, in a hotel, Mr. Brownlow met them, with a man that Oliver was very surprised to see. "This is the man I saw with Fagin!" he cried. Monks looked with hatred at Oliver. "Yes, Oliver," said Mr. Brownlow gently, "this is your half-brother. And this," he said, turning to Monks, "is Oliver, the son of your father, my dear friend, and poor young Agnes Fleming, who died when Oliver was born. Now you must complete the story." And so Monks began. "Our father and his wife, my mother, were separated when I was young, and I grew to hate my father. My mother went to see him when he was dying in Paris, and there she found some papers. There was a letter to Agnes, asking forgiveness if he should die before they could be married, and reminding her of the locket he'd given her, and a ring with her name engraved on it." "And the will?" said Mr. Brownlow. Monks remained silent, so Brownlow continued. "Your father left a will in which he left an income of £800 a year to Monks and his mother. But the rest of his property went to Agnes and their child if it should live and reach adulthood without committing any unlawful or mean act." "My mother," said Monks more loudly now, "burnt this will and never sent the letter. She gave it to me before she died, and I promised I would find the child if there was one. When I happened by chance to see Oliver with Fagin, I knew I could turn him into a criminal, and he would not inherit anything." "The story is nearly over now," said Mr. Brownlow, "but there is one more thing to say. Agnes had a much younger sister she never knew. She was brought up by a kind lady as if she were her own mother. Monks, do you see Agnes's sister here?" "Yes, leaning on your arm." "Oh, Rose!" cried Oliver, throwing his arms around her neck. "My mother's sister and my aunt! But I could never call you aunt. You'll always be my sister." In that moment he had lost and gained a father, mother, and sister, and Oliver didn't know how he could feel so much sadness and such joy at one time. Chapter 13. Fagin's Last Hours. The court was packed from floor to roof with faces. Every eye was fixed on one man, Fagin. When the jury retired to consider their verdict, people began chatting to each other or eating or fanning themselves with handkerchiefs. At last there came a cry for "Silence!" and the jury returned. Their verdict: guilty. The judge ominously donned the customary black cap. For his many crimes, the prisoner would be hanged from the neck until he was dead. The sentence to be carried out on Monday morning. Fagin, a bewildered look on his face, was led away. As darkness came on in his cell in Newgate Prison, Fagin began to think of all the men he had known who had died upon the gallows. Some of them betrayed by him. Their faces rose up before him in the dark. Panic-stricken, he beat against the heavy door, crying out for a light. At last 2 men appeared. One held a candle, the other dragged in a mattress. Fagin lay the rest of the night listening to the church clocks marking off the hours towards morning. The boom of every bell, laden with despair. Saturday passed quickly, then Sunday came, and with it a withering sense of his own helplessness. He hurried about his cell with gasping breath and burning skin, consumed with anger and fear. Even the hardened watchman shrank from him. Some time before dawn on Monday, Mr. Brownlow and Oliver entered Newgate and were conducted to Fagin's cell.
"Here's somebody wants to ask you some questions, Fagin,"
said the jailer. Fagin sat there, muttering to himself, a dreadful expression of rage and terror twisting his face. "You have some papers," began Mr. Brownlow, "which were put in your hands by a man called Monks."
"It's a lie,"
Fagin replied. "For the love of God," said Mr. Brownlow, "where are those papers?"
"Oliver,"
cried Fagin,
"let me whisper to you."
"I'm not afraid," said Oliver, letting go of Mr. Brownlow's hand.
"The papers,"
Fagin hissed in his ear,
"are in a bag a little way up the chimney in the top front room."
Then he grabbed the boy.
"I want to talk to you, my dear. They'll believe you. You can get me out."
"Have you nothing else to ask him, sir?" the jailer asked Mr. Brownlow. "No other question," replied Mr. Brownlow. They pulled Oliver from Fagin's clutches. Fagin's chilling cries rang in their ears until they reached the yard. It was dawn by the time they left the prison. Already a crowd was gathering around the black stage of the scaffold. Now the tale of Oliver's fortunes is nearly told. Mr. Brownlow adopted Oliver, and they went to live in the same village as Rose and Mrs. Maylie, and they were truly happy. And in the old village church there now stands a white marble tablet which bears the one word Agnes, in memory of Oliver's mother, a mother whom he never knew, but whose love seemed to protect him even beyond the grave. You've been listening to Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, and I'm Tony Robinson. Thank you for listening.